December 10th, 1926.
Stockholm.
A woman who never finished elementary school stands before kings, scholars, and the world's greatest writers. In her hands, the Nobel Prize in Literature, the second woman ever to receive it. But here's what makes this absolutely devastating. Every man in that room had spent years saying she was too uneducated, too provincial, too Sardinian to matter. She just proved them all wrong, on the world's biggest stage. But how did a girl from a shepherding village, a place so remote most Italians couldn't even find it on a map, destroy the entire Italian literary establishment? This is Grazia Deledda. And if you want to see how she obliterated everyone who said a woman with a fourth-grade education had no business writing literature, hit subscribe right now. Because this story gets darker. They didn't just underestimate her. They tried to destroy her. So, who was trying to destroy her? And why did they fear a shepherding girl from the poorest, most backward part of Italy? To understand that, you need to understand what Sardinia meant to mainland Italians in the 1890s. It wasn't just poor. It wasn't just isolated. It was a joke. The place Italians referenced when they wanted to call something primitive, backwards, uncivilized. And here's Grazia Deledda, born in 1871 in the mountain village of Nuoro. A girl from that island who decided she was going to be a writer. Not just any writer, a serious writer. The kind who would force the Italian literary elite to take Sardinia seriously. The kind who would make them see her people as human. The men who controlled Italian literature, professors, critics, publishers in Rome, Milan, Florence, they had one response to this idea: laughter. And then when she wouldn't stop writing, when she kept sending them her work, they declared war. And here's the thing that's going to make you scream: they almost won. Let me tell you exactly who built the system designed to keep Grazia Deledda silent. First, her own father, a small business owner who thought educating daughters beyond basic literacy was a waste. Grazia got 4 years of elementary school.
4.
Then she was pulled out to help run the household. Her brothers? They went to university. She got needlework. Second, the village of Nuoro itself. In 1880s Sardinia, a girl who wrote stories wasn't charming. She was dangerous, suspicious. People whispered she was possessed. Literally. The village priest warned her mother she was inviting the devil into their home. Third, the Italian publishing industry, controlled entirely by men, based entirely in the north, obsessed entirely with European cosmopolitan culture. If you weren't writing about Rome or Florence or Paris, if you were writing about shepherds and peasants and Sardinian folklore, you weren't real literature. You were provincial trash. And here's the absolute genius of this conspiracy. They didn't have to formally ban women or Sardinians from writing. They just made it impossible. No education beyond elementary school? How can you compete with university-educated men? No money? How can you travel to Rome or Milan to network with publishers? No social connections? How can you get published when every editor only publishes his friends? They built a perfect trap, and Grazia was locked inside it at age 10. So, what did Grazia Deledda do that terrified them? She committed the unforgivable crime. She refused to accept that her story, her people's story, didn't matter. At 13 years old, while her brothers studied Latin and philosophy, Grazia taught herself Italian literature. Remember, Sardinians spoke Sardinian, not Italian. She had to learn the language of her oppressors. At 14, she wrote her first story, about Sardinian shepherds,
About the land she knew.
about the people she loved. At 16, she sent it to a fashion magazine. A fashion magazine. Because that was the only publication that would even consider stories by women. And they published it. The men in her village? They went ballistic. How dare she write about Sardinian life for mainlanders to read? How dare she expose their culture to outside judgment? The town gossips called her a traitor. The priest called her shameful. Even her own father was humiliated. But here's what the village didn't understand. Grazia had just tasted power. Because when that story published, when it appeared in print with her name on it, she realized something that would fuel her for the next 50 years. They could control her education. They could control her movement. They could control her reputation in Nuoro. But they couldn't control her words. Once they were published, they belonged to the world. And that's when the Italian literary establishment made their first attempt to crush her. They ignored her.
Completely. Totally.
Deliberately. For 5 years, she sent stories to every literary journal in Italy. And for 5 years, radio silence. Because in their minds, if they didn't respond, she'd eventually give up. Women always gave up. But Grazia Deledda wasn't women. She was a force of nature. And she was about to prove it. Here's where Grazia did something brilliant. While the Italian literary elite ignored her, she studied them.
Hard.
She read every major Italian writer, analyzed every successful literary journal, learned exactly what they valued, what they praised, what they published. And she noticed something. They were all men writing about the same things. Bourgeois life, urban romance, European sophistication. There wasn't a single writer giving literary attention to rural Italy, to the peasants and shepherds who made up most of the country, to the ancient traditions being destroyed by modernization. That was her opening, her weapon. But she needed allies. And in 1890s Italy, where could a Sardinian village girl find literary allies? She found them in the one place the male establishment overlooked: women's magazines. Grazia started publishing story after story in these magazines. They didn't pay much. They weren't prestigious. But they had readers. Thousands of Italian women reading her stories about Sardinian peasant life, about women's struggles, about love and loss in the mountains. And slowly, quietly, she built an audience. By age 21, she'd published over 40 stories.
40.
The male critics still hadn't noticed her. They didn't read women's magazines, but readers had. And some of those readers, they were starting to write letters to literary journals asking, "Who is this Grazia Deledda? Why haven't we heard of her?" And that's when one editor made a catastrophic mistake. He finally read her work, and he loved it. In 1892, Edmondo de Amicis, one of Italy's most famous writers, praised her in print, called her a writer of authentic talent. Now Grazia was living a double life. In Nuoro, in Sardinia, she played the role everyone expected: the dutiful daughter, the quiet village girl. She wore traditional Sardinian dress. She attended church. She helped her mother with household duties. But in her room, late at night, she was someone completely different. She was writing novels. Not short stories anymore, full novels. Ambitious, sweeping, psychological. Stories about Sardinian women trapped by tradition, about the violence of poverty, about the crushing weight of village judgment. And she was sending them to publishers in Rome under her own name, Grazia Deledda. Not a pseudonym, not hiding behind a man's name. Her own name. The publishers didn't know what to do with her. On one hand, her writing was good, really good. On the other hand, she was a woman from Sardinia, with an elementary school education. How could they publish her alongside Dante scholars and philosophy professors? In 1894, she published her first novel, Anime Oneste, Honest Souls. The reviews were complicated. Critics praised her natural talent and authentic voice. But they also called her work unrefined, unpolished, lacking intellectual sophistication. Translation: she's good, but she's not educated enough to be taken seriously. The message was clear: know your place. And here's where most people would have quit. Or at least would have tried to sound more sophisticated, more educated, more like the male writers. But Grazia? She doubled down. Her next novel was more Sardinian, more about peasants, more about traditions the urban elite found backwards. Because she understood something they didn't. Her lack of sophistication, her provincial subject matter, her unrefined style, that wasn't a weakness. That was her weapon. She was writing about a world they didn't know, couldn't know, would never know, and readers were starving for it. And that's when the backlash began. Because the male literary establishment, they just realized she wasn't going away. 1899, Grazia Deledda makes a move that shocks everyone. She marries a government official, Palmiro Maidsani, and moves to Rome, the center of Italian literary power. She's 28 years old. She's published 3 novels, and she's about to walk into the lion's den. The male writers of Rome had this nice little club. They met in cafes. They discussed literature. They decided who mattered and who didn't. And they did not want Grazia Deledda at their table. But Grazia didn't need their table. In Rome, she had access to the best publishers, to the biggest literary journals, to the readers who actually decided what became popular. And in 1900, she published La Via del Male, The Way of Evil. This novel was different, darker, more psychologically complex, about a Sardinian woman's forbidden love, about sin and redemption, about the cruelty of village judgment. It was her most ambitious work yet, and critics hated that they loved it. They couldn't ignore the quality, but they couldn't bring themselves to put her on the same level as male writers. So they invented a new category just for her: regional writer. Not a real writer, a regional one, a primitive one, someone documenting folklore, not creating literature. And this is where Grazia proved she was a genius. She said, "Fine, call me regional." And then she kept publishing novels, better novels, deeper novels, novels that made it impossible to dismiss her as just a folklorist. By 1903, she'd published 8 novels.
8.
The male critics couldn't keep up with her. Every time they tried to box her in, she'd publish something that broke the box. And that's when she did the one thing that made them realize she was dangerous. She got popular, really popular. Her books started selling thousands of copies. Readers across Italy were buying her work, women especially, but also men who'd never read about rural life before. The Italian literary elite had a problem. They could ignore her when she was just a Sardinian oddity, but they couldn't ignore her when she was outselling them. And that's when they came for her. Hard. 1904 to 1910 was open warfare. Male critics started writing essays claiming her success proved Italian literature was degenerating, that publishers were catering to feminine sentimentality instead of serious art. They questioned whether she even wrote her own novels. Maybe her husband wrote them. Maybe she had a ghostwriter. Because surely a woman with only elementary school education couldn't produce work this sophisticated. They attacked her personally, called her unrefined, unsophisticated, lacking culture. One critic literally wrote, "Deledda writes like a peasant because she is a peasant. She may have moved to Rome, but Rome hasn't civilized her." But here's what really made them furious. She kept writing about Sardinia. After years in Rome, she didn't start writing about Roman society. She didn't abandon her roots for respectability. She doubled down. Again. In 1913, she published Can al Vento, Reeds in the Wind, a masterpiece about 3 elderly sisters in rural Sardinia, about tradition versus modernity, about women's sacrifices. The critics were forced to acknowledge it was brilliant, but they did it through gritted teeth. One review said, "Despite its provincial setting and simple characters, this work achieves something approaching real literature." Translation: "We hate that this is good." The price for her success? She was exhausted, bitter, isolated from the literary establishment even as she outsold them. Her family in Sardinia had disowned her for betraying Sardinian privacy by writing about it. The Romans called her a backward Sardinian. The Sardinians called her a traitor to Sardinia. She was caught between 2 worlds, and neither wanted her. This is where most people would have quit, where the loneliness would have won. But Grazia Deledda had one advantage her critics never understood. She didn't need them to like her. She just needed them to read her. World War I changed Italy, but it didn't change Grazia Deledda. While male writers were publishing more propaganda and patriotic nonsense, Grazia kept writing about what she knew: human psychology, moral complexity, women's interior lives. 1916, L'incendio nell'oliveto, Fire in the Olive Grove, about passion and destruction. 1920, La Madre, the mother. About a priest's mother watching her son torn between faith and desire. 1921. Il segreto dell'uomo solitario, the secret of the solitary man. About isolation and human connection. She was prolific. While critics debated whether women could write serious literature, she was publishing novel after novel after novel. And they were getting better,
Deeper.
more psychologically complex. But here's where it gets interesting. She started getting translated. French editions, German editions, Spanish editions. And European critics? They didn't have the same baggage as Italian critics. They didn't care that she was Sardinian or that she lacked formal education. They just read the work, and they called her brilliant. This infuriated the Italian establishment, because now they couldn't just dismiss her as regional. Europe was taking her seriously. Europe was calling her one of Italy's best living writers. And Italian critics looked like fools for having ignored her for decades. In 1923, something shifted. Major Italian literary journals started calling her an important Italian writer. Not regional writer. Not woman writer. Just writer. But it was too late for them to pretend they'd supported her all along. Everyone knew they'd tried to bury her. And Grazia? She didn't forget. She kept her distance from the literary establishment, barely attended their events, rarely gave interviews. She had what she needed: readers, international respect, and a body of work they couldn't erase. 1925, Grazia Deledda gets nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Nobel Prize, the highest literary honor in the world. And the Italian literary establishment? They panicked. Because here's the thing about the Nobel Prize. It's decided by the Swedish Academy, not by Italian critics. And the Swedish Academy was seriously considering giving it to a woman with an elementary school education who wrote about shepherds. The Italian literati did everything they could to sabotage her. They wrote letters claiming she wasn't representative of Italian literature. They pushed their own candidates, male professors, male poets, male intellectuals. They argued that giving the Nobel to Deledda would embarrass Italy, make them look backwards, provincial, unsophisticated. And for a moment, it looked like it might work. The Swedish Academy delayed, reconsidered, debated. Grazia heard the rumors. She knew what was happening. She knew they were trying to steal this from her. And this was the crisis point. Because if the Nobel went to someone else, if the establishment won this battle, it would prove that no matter how good she was, no matter how much she sold, no matter how much Europe loved her, she would never be enough. Could never be enough. The committee deliberated for months. Grazia kept writing, because that's what she did. That's what she'd always done. But she must have wondered, would they do it? Would they actually give the Nobel Prize to a girl from Moro? This is where most people would have quit, where the uncertainty would have broken them. But Grazia Deledda had spent 35 years being underestimated. She knew how to wait. She knew how to survive. November 1926. The announcement comes. The Nobel Prize in Literature goes to Grazia Deledda for her idealistically inspired writings which with plastic clarity picture the life on her native island and with depth and sympathy deal with human problems in general. Let me tell you what this meant. The second woman ever to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, after Selma Lagerlöf in 1909. The first Italian woman to win any Nobel Prize. A woman who never finished elementary school. A woman from the poorest, most backward region of Italy. A woman the Italian literary establishment had spent decades trying to erase. And here's the genius of this moment. The Swedish Academy didn't just give her the prize. They validated her entire approach. They praised her because she wrote about Sardinia, because she focused on peasant life, because she brought plastic clarity to a world others ignored. Everything the Italian critics had called a weakness, the Swedish Academy called it her strength. But wait, it gets better. Remember how the Italian establishment tried to sabotage her nomination? How they said giving her the Nobel would embarrass Italy. The moment she won, they all immediately claimed credit. Italian newspapers declared it a victory for Italian literature. Critics who'd spent years calling her unrefined suddenly wrote essays about her sophisticated psychological realism. The same people who questioned whether she wrote her own work now called her Italy's greatest living novelist. And Grazia? She saw exactly what they were doing. In her Nobel acceptance speech, delivered in Stockholm in December 1926, she didn't thank the Italian literary establishment. She thanked Sardinia, her people, her island. She wore traditional Sardinian dress to the ceremony, not a fashionable European gown. She made sure everyone knew this wasn't a victory for Italian literature. This was a victory for Sardinia, for the place they'd all mocked, for the people they'd all dismissed. And the best part? The part that makes this the perfect revenge? She didn't do it by becoming what they wanted. She did it by being exactly what they said she couldn't be. Uneducated? She proved education didn't determine genius. Provincial? She proved provincial stories were universal. Too Sardinian? She made Sardinia matter on the world stage. Let me tell you about the specific men who had to watch Grazia Deledda win. Benedetto Croce, Italy's most influential critic. The man who'd spent years saying Italian literature was being feminized, who'd argued women writers were diluting serious art. He had to write a formal tribute to Deledda. Had to, because the Nobel Prize winner from his own country deserved recognition. And you can feel the pain in his words. Deledda has achieved a certain, genuine artistic quality. Translation: I hate that she won. Luigi Pirandello, who would win the Nobel himself in 1934, had dismissed Deledda's work as primitive naturalism. After her win, he called her a master of psychological depth. Every publisher who'd rejected her work, every journal that had ignored her submissions, every critic who'd called her unsophisticated, they all had to watch her receive the world's highest literary honor. And here's the delicious irony. Her Nobel Prize didn't just vindicate her. It changed what Italian literature meant. Before Deledda, Italian literature was defined by urban intellectuals writing about European culture. After Deledda, Italian literature included regional voices, rural stories, women's perspectives. She didn't just win. She redefined the game. But the revenge goes even deeper. Remember how the village of Nuoro had ostracized her? How they called her a traitor for writing about Sardinian life? After she won the Nobel Prize, Nuoro built her a statue. The same people who'd whispered she was possessed now claimed her as their greatest daughter. The same village that had tried to silence her now made her their symbol of pride. And Grazia? She barely visited. She knew exactly what their sudden love was worth. She lived another 10 years after winning the Nobel, died in 1936 at age 64. And in those final 10 years, she kept writing, kept publishing, kept proving it wasn't a fluke. She published 3 more novels after winning the Nobel Prize. Because that's the ultimate revenge, isn't it? They spent decades saying she'd gotten lucky, that she'd gotten attention because she was exotic, different, a curiosity. And she spent those decades proving she was simply better, more prolific, more psychologically complex, more willing to explore difficult truths. Better. But here's where the story gets infuriating. Because even after all of this, even after the Nobel Prize, they still tried to erase her. Want to know the most enraging part of this story? For most of the 20th century, if you studied Italian literature in university, even in Italy, you might not learn about Grazia Deledda. She'd be a footnote, a mention. Oh yes, the Nobel Prize winner from Sardinia. Literary historians focused on male writers. Pirandello, D'Annunzio, Svivo. Deledda? She was regional, sentimental, minor. The same words they'd used when she was alive. And here's why they did this. Because her success was inconvenient. She proved you didn't need formal education to create great literature. She proved women could write psychological complexity. She proved regional stories could be universal. She proved the entire Italian literary establishment had been wrong. So they did what they always do when history is inconvenient. They minimized it. Yes, she won the Nobel, but it was a political choice. Yes, she sold well, but she wrote for popular audiences, not serious readers. Yes, she was talented, but she wasn't an intellectual. For decades, her books went out of print. Her work wasn't taught. Her name faded. The girl from Nuoro, who'd conquered European literature, was being forgotten. And the Italian literary establishment thought they'd won. Finally. But they didn't win. Because here's what they forgot. Her books survived. 22 novels. Hundreds of stories. All documenting a world that no longer exists. And starting in the 1980s, in the 1990s, in the 2000s, feminist scholars started asking questions. Why don't we study Deledda? Why isn't she in the canon? Why did a Nobel Prize winner disappear from literary history? And the more they looked, the more they found a pattern. Brilliant woman. Achieved the impossible. Deliberately erased by the men she defeated. Sound familiar? Today, Grazia Deledda is being reclaimed. New translations. New academic studies. New recognition in Italian schools. The Grazia Deledda Museum in Nuoro, in the house where she grew up, draws thousands of visitors. And her story resonates today because the same battles are still being fought. Who gets to be considered serious? Who gets to tell their story? Who gets remembered? And Grazia Deledda's life proves they can try to erase you. They can minimize you. They can call you regional, sentimental, minor. But if your work is true, if your voice is authentic, if you refuse to be silenced, history will find you. Readers will find you. The erasure fails. Grazia Deledda. 4th grade education. Sardinian shepherding village. Female. All the things that should have kept her silent. Instead, she destroyed every barrier they built. She didn't just win the Nobel Prize. She proved the entire Italian literary establishment was wrong about who deserved to be heard. They tried to erase her. She erased them from relevance. This is what revenge looks like when you do it with words. Hit subscribe for weekly revenge stories of women history tried to erase. And drop a comment. What woman's story do you think we need to tell next?